Hi everybody, good afternoon. My name is Barbara Landis and I'm on staff here at the Cumberland County Historical Society. My official title is Carlisle Indian Industrial School Archives and Library Specialist. And I've been here since 1987. So I'm probably the longest working person here, which is why my staff has abandoned me and I'm introducing myself. But about twice a year, the Historical Society offers tours over at the Carlisle Indian School grounds, at the Carlisle Barracks. And we decided, because it seems to be getting more and more difficult to get through the security at the barracks, what we decided to do is to offer a virtual tour so that we're going to imagine ourselves over at the Carlisle Barracks. And then if you all want to go over there and tour the grounds, you'll have some context to take over with you. And I do have information about the security and how you can get onto the base, and we have forms here that you can fill out. So if you want to run right over there after we're done, feel free. But what I'm going to do is, with the help of several maps, I'm a map person, so I've been delving into the maps for the last few days trying to sort of put this together. So what I wanted to do, my plan is to introduce you to the school grounds. Now, this is an aerial view of the Carlisle Barracks with a Google map superimposed over it of the Carlisle Barracks. And then this banner photo is the vista of what I call the quad area, which is kind of the main area of the campus, where all of the buildings were pretty much contained by this quad area. And so what I've done is I have taken on the far left the 1872 map of the Carlisle Barracks from our atlas in our collections. And the Carlisle Indian School was founded in 1879. So that map on the far left kind of gives you some idea of what buildings, what structures were there during the opening of the Indian School. Then the map in the middle is the General Hospital map that would have been designed right around 1919. The Indian School closed in 1918. So what you're seeing is most of the buildings that were there during the life of the school, or that were added during the life of the school. And then this map on the right is a contemporary map that shows what buildings are at the barracks now. And the shaded buildings, the lightly shaded buildings, are those buildings that are still in existence that would be pertaining to the Indian School. Now, this is a walking tour that the Historical Society sells that contains all three of these maps, and also a contemporary map that shows where all of the buildings are at the Carlisle Barracks. So if you have a burning desire to go over there after this, you might want to pick up one of these maps in our shop. So that's the plan, that's the way I formulated this talk, by putting together these three maps. And you're going to see these three maps repeated throughout the presentation. But I wanted to start with a most interesting photograph. This photograph was taken in 1998 when Bo Bridges and Scott Momaday were here working on a movie about the Carlisle Indian School. And when they started doing their research, they did go over and get a tour, and we started talking about the first arrival of the very first group of Indian kids to come to Carlisle, and how they came into the Gettysburg Junction Do y'all know where the Gettysburg Junction is? It's right there on that map. That is the East Step Electric Company. Do you know the little East Step Electric down? If you take Lowther Street, go straight down Lowther Street and it empties out into Wengers, by Wengers, right across there is the old Gettysburg Junction. And there were railroad tracks that went through there. And when Richard Henry Pratt, the founder of the Indian School, decided to start his experiment at Carlisle, he went to the Pine Ridge Sioux and Rosebud Sioux reservations in South Dakota, and he got about 80 Indian kids from those two nations and brought them to Carlisle by train. And instead of bringing them into the train station in town, he literally tried to sneak them in to the little Gettysburg Junction in the middle of the night, because as he had traveled by steamer and train from South Dakota, every time they would go through a train station, all the non-native people would come to the train station to kind of gawk at these, you know, what they considered bizarre or savage Indian kids. And so Pratt really wanted them to have, one of the children to have as normal as possible an arrival. So he brought them in at midnight to the Gettysburg Junction. And when he got off the train, there were hundreds of townspeople from Carlisle there to greet them because they had gotten word that the Indian kids were coming in. So they walked from the old junction into the entrance of the school grounds. And these stars are the different entrances to the barracks. Now in 1879, there was only one entrance, and that was by the old guardhouse. By 1918, there were two entrances. The new improved entrance that Pratt had designed, and the entrance by the guardhouse, which happened to be where the railroad tracks ran by that time. So that was a much more dangerous place to come in after the railroad moved the line. You all know that the railroad came right up Main Street, which is High Street today, went like over a trestle, and it ended up going right past the gate at the barracks. The railroad tracks are still there. And then in 2018, now, after 9/11 and the rerouting of the security over at the barracks, the only entrance is at what we always used to call the back gate. So neither of those two entrances are still viable today. But originally, the entrance was, and I apologize for this fuzzy photo, but I wanted you to see the guardhouse. At the far left edge of that guardhouse was a gate, and that was where that first group of kids, and most of the kids, came into the Indian School grounds. This road right in front of the postcard is Garrison Lane. If you're driving down North Street and you come to where the Sentinel building, is the Sentinel still there? Well, where it used to be, I guess, right on the corner, is Garrison Lane. If you were to turn left up into Garrison Lane and keep going, you will come to the original entrance of the Indian School. It's all fenced over. Yeah.
The building you have up there, is that stone building that's now a Hessian museum?
That's the Hessian Powder Magazine.
Thank you.
It's the old Hessian guardhouse. Yeah. And we'll visit that again later. Right now, I wanted you to get an idea of the entrances. So, in the 1890s, Pratt, the founder of the Indian School, designed a new entrance that he considered the sexier entrance, because you didn't have to go along the guardhouse. You actually walked in through a lane from the old Harrisburg Pike, what's now Route 11, or the Carlisle Road. You walk straight up there, and of course they named that Pratt Avenue after the superintendent of the Indian School. So we'll visit the superintendent's quarters next, because we want to talk about who started the Indian School, how it got founded, And that is the buildings that were converted to the superintendent quarters were in 1879. They had been built for the Civil War as BOQs. I guess that's Army talk, right? For bachelor officer quarters, right? And the bachelor officers' quarters were converted to the superintendent's house, who was Richard Henry Pratt. Richard Henry Pratt, the fellow on the left, was a former cavalry officer who had been assigned to several of the forts during the Indian Wars. He was at Fort Sill in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, Fort Arbuckle, I forget the other forts where he was, but he was assigned to do administrative work at those forts. And he ultimately ended up escorting a group of Indian prisoners to St. Augustine, Florida. And it was during that process that he came up with his plan, his philosophy for Indian assimilation. And what you are looking at is the superintendent quarters there, which look very much like that today. If we go over to the barracks, that building is still very similar. And in this photo, which I call the Sea of Children, if any of you have heard my talks before, you've heard me describe who these children are. Now you're going to hear me use the term Indian throughout this program, which is certainly not politically correct, but in keeping with the history of the time. And most of my native friends call themselves Indian. Actually, they call themselves Molly or Joe or Freddie. But what you see here is this. If you were to superimpose a map of the United States over this image, imagine Alaskan natives, Mission from California, Coeur d'Alene and Spokane from Washington State and Idaho, all of the Anishinaabe nations, all the bands of what were called Chippewa at the Carlisle School from Minnesota, Michigan. You would have all the Dakotas, you would have all the Sioux language groups, Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, represented in these images. So, moving across New Hampshire, you'd have Abenaki from Maine, and you'd have Mashpee from Massachusetts, and you'd have Shinnecock from Long Island, and you had Seminole from Florida, and Caddo from Texas. Just all the southwestern nations were represented, the Pueblos, the Diné, or the Navajo people. This is like a virtual United Nations of nations in this image. And these children did not speak the same languages. They did not share the same traditions. They were brought to this place without being able to communicate with each other unless they used sign language. And so the populations who were at this, what I call experiment, were very diverse. And, it's important to recognize who these children were. We know of 10,700 names of children from virtually every nation represented in these faces at Carlisle. And they're standing, the superintendent's quarters would be the second house from the right. That's where Pratt lived. That's where he raised his children. His grandchildren visited him at Carlisle. So he was instrumental in developing this experiment and keeping it going for 25 years. And then when he retired or was fired in 1904, depending on how you read the history, there were several other superintendents who took over. And so the experiment continued until 1918. So for almost a 40-year period, this experiment was held in our community just about 1.5 miles down the road from here. So we visited the superintendent's quarters. Now we're going to go to the chapel. And part of the process, the assimilation process that Pratt and the United States had in mind was to also Christianize these children, many of whom had not been exposed to Christianity. Many of them had, but some of them had not. The ones who were more assimilated, who had gone to mission schools, came to Carlisle speaking some English, being able to read and write, but there were many children who did not know how to read and write. And when Pratt first arrived, he enlisted the help of a group of Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho prisoners who had been arrested by the United States in 1875 before the Carlisle School was even a dream in Pratt's mind. And Pratt was their jailer and accompanied them to St. Augustine, Florida. If any of you have ever been down to the old fort that sits on the water, you know, the old Castillo de San Marcos fort there. Well, that was under the jurisdiction of the War Department in 1875. And these prisoners of war, who were the most problematic of those four nations, who refused to stay on the reservations. The reservation system was still relatively new then, in 1875. And these were the guys that would go off and hunt or raid or harass the incoming settlers coming through their lands. And so the United States arrested them for a period of 3 years, and they were imprisoned at the old fort, and Pratt was their jailer. And when he got them to St. Augustine, he cut their hair and he removed their shackles, and he dismissed the guards who were assigned to police them, and he organized them into military regiments where they policed each other, and he set up a ranking system, and all of this fed his ideas about how to solve the so-called Indian problem of the time. You know, this whole experiment, this prisoner of war part of the story fed his philosophies about what he was going to do at Carlisle. And so after their time of imprisonment was up in 1878, Pratt was able to convince about a dozen of these guys to take formal education, and he tried to find schools that would take them instead of going back to their home communities. And so he was able to find one institution that would take these prisoners, and that was the Hampton School for Negro Children in Hampton, Virginia, which is now Hampton University, one of our traditional black colleges. So these guys got trained at Hampton, and then they came up to help Pratt set up the Carlisle Indian School. And the long story that I just told you explains that picture of those guys on the roof, roofing the chapel. Those are the Fort Marion prisoners who helped Pratt set up the Carlisle School. So there's this connection between the Kiowa, Comanche, Cheyenne, and Arapaho communities and the very first group to set up the Carlisle School. Yeah.
Were they still prisoners when they were?
No, they were no longer prisoners. Their time of incarceration was finished in 1878 when they went to the Hampton School. And the remainder of those guys that you see went back to their agencies. And many of them had been converted to Christianity and started missioning to their own people. Okay, so our next stop, we're moving right along. Now we're going to go to the large boys' quarters. There were 2 sets of dormitories for boys and 1 for girls. And the large boys' quarters were located where the stone building is now. That was the Military History Institute, and now I believe it's offices. if you can picture the barracks, that frame, three-story building was completely replaced by a stone building in the 1930s. So this building is no longer standing. But you can actually see the interior of the boys' bedroom in this picture. And again, the translation of the photos to the big screen is not very clean. But I did find this at Dickinson College's digitization website. Yeah.
When you mentioned the stone building, are you talking about the one that flies the British flag? Is that what you?
Does it have a British flag?
Yeah.
The headquarters building has a British flag, and I think it's
It's
spelled
the,
as well.
yeah, it's the headquarters building. It's the building that is right next to the gym, like
Yeah.
adjacent to the gym.
It's called Upton Hall.
Upton Hall, thank you. That's it, that's the building. Yeah, that's where the boys, the large boys, had their dormitory, where Upton Hall is. And then on the eastern flank of that quad was the small boys' quarters, where those two brick quarters are now. There was kind of this long two-story building, and that was where the small boys lived at the Carlisle School. None of the buildings where children actually lived are still standing. So that's something to keep in mind. There was a ghost story about Lucy Pretty Eagle that circulated around for years and kept getting resurrected, and those of us who are public historians would get outraged because, you know, it was completely based on misinformation. I think there might be quarters that are haunted over at Carlisle Barracks, but they're not what were the girls' quarters. They were the teachers' quarters. So here are the girls' quarters, and where this building stands today now are tennis courts. So if you know the campus over there, these tennis courts, this building was a huge three-story frame building that was attached literally to the gym by a kind of a walkway. If you look at the far left photo down, you know, in that kind of faded section in the back, you can see what looks like sort of a barn structure. That was built as the gym for the Carlisle Indian School. But this is where the girls lived, and the campus was essentially segregated, with the girls to the south and the boys to the northern part of the campus. And they tried to keep the male and female students from fraternizing with one another as much as possible, especially during the Pratt years. There was one original structure from the 1879 map that shows where the teachers' quarters were. And then more quarters for teachers were built throughout the years. So ultimately there were 4 different areas where teachers lived at the Carlisle Indian School. Now, when you think back to Pratt and his ideas about Indian education and formulating this experiment, one thing that influenced him a lot was the whole Quaker structure. He, because of his connection to St. Augustine, which was a hotbed of Quaker thought, in the wintertime, you know, Quakers would, from the Philadelphia area, would get on a steamer and go right down the coast to St. Augustine, Florida, and many of them had their winter homes there. So they, and you know, the Quakers were very interested in almost all the reform-related movements, because altruism is so much a part of their philosophy. And so after the Civil War was over, the next sort of reform movement was this, you know, solving the so-called Indian problem. So it was very easy for Pratt to enlist the support of Quakers into this whole thought about how to deal with the Indians and the assimilation movement and the boarding school movement. So almost all of his early teachers were Quakers who were handpicked from the Bucks County, Berks County area, who had ties to his St. Augustine contacts. And so that is who you would see early on. There's a picture of his teachers with the bandstand in the background. Most of them were Quaker, and most of them were women as well. This fuzzy picture here is a photo I found called Pupil Teachers. Some of the students who went through the program and graduated then went on to become pupil teachers at the Carlisle School. And you know, when you think of that sea of children and you know, the enrollment numbers were in the thousands. Like I said, we know of 10,700 names. And you look at the complement of teachers, that's not a very high ratio of teachers to students. So, you know, it was really helpful for Pratt to be able to set up a regimentation among the students. When they arrived, their regalia or traditional clothing was removed, and they were put into uniforms, which were made in the tailor shop of the school. And they were organized into regiments and brigades and companies and units so that they could police each other. This whole structure that was developed from the St. Augustine experience became how Carlisle was organized. So every kid would have been given a rank, and that would have made order a lot easier for him as the years went on. But this building, these two buildings that you see right here, they were built using Indian labor. The Carlisle Indian School was an industrial training school, which meant that every student who came to the school was assigned to a specific trade and would learn academics for half a day and then trades for the other half day. So if you were a male, you would be learning carpentry, blacksmithing, tinsmithing, and we'll look at that when we look at the shops a little bit more. But, you know, these teachers' buildings were made using Indian labor. Yeah.
You mentioned that the boys and girls were segregated.
Mm-hmm.
Did the boys only get male teachers and the females only get female teachers?
No. The Wheelock Bandstand is, you know, in any army post, any of y'all who've been raised in the army like I was, or if you've spent time on military bases, oftentimes there's a bandstand sort of in the heart of the campus, and there was at Carlisle too. And the bandstand factored into a lot of photo opportunities. Whenever visiting tribal headmen would come to Carlisle, they would pose on the bandstand with Pratt. And you can see how that happened, like with this group of Navajo students who came, where they're in their regalia still. And then of course there's another photograph of them all in uniform. Pratt used before and after photos to publicize what he was doing at Carlisle. That's a group of tribal headmen, chiefs, who came early on to Carlisle and, you know, had their photos taken by the bandstand. The band, the Carlisle Indian School band, performed and had jurisdiction over the bandstand, basically. And that Carlisle band was a very well-known band and traveled all over the country. In the summertime, the band would go to Atlantic City, go to the seashore for the summer, and the band also marched in every single presidential inaugural parade during that 40-year period. The band marched at the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge during the earliest days of the school. And in the very center of this collage of photos is Denison Wheelock and his brothers and sister, who was the band leader. He was an Oneida student from Wisconsin, and he became the band leader and was the instructor of band for many years at the Carlisle School. And when he left in around 1901, his brother James Riley Wheelock took over the band. And James Riley Wheelock went on to become a very famous band leader. He would work and march with John Philip Sousa's band. It's kind of the warm-up band for Sousa. So now we're going to visit the printing office. And the printing office was actually edited by the man on the bandstand. I got ahead of myself here. And printing was a really important part of the industries taught at Carlisle. I started to mention some of the trades. One of the industries was printing, and printing was co-ed. There were males and females in the printing office. But the school published weekly and monthly newspapers, and the Cumberland County Historical Society has probably the largest collection of these newspapers. And much of the material in the newspapers is what informs my interpretation of this history. Because I've been working with descendants now for 25 years, and when someone's looking for information about their relatives at the school, these newspapers are an amazing source of information because, you know, they have all kinds of little newsy articles about students who are at the school. They're very heavily propagandized. There's not any bad information anywhere in these newspapers, but there is good information that tells us where students were sent when they went out, what questions they were debating during the debating society years. It's just an incredible amount of information. And what we find is that relatives of Indian school students, the next generations, and now we're 2 and 3 generations away from those ancestors. A lot of times when people went back to their home communities, they didn't talk about what happened at Carlisle. They never spoke of it. And so there was this hole in the stories of families that is starting to be pieced together little by little through the school records, which are being digitized by Dickinson College, which are a great source of information because there is some bad stuff in there. Not that that makes it good, but there is correspondence in the student records that never got to families, that never made it back home, that tell a lot of interesting stories. And there's also wonderful correspondence from students writing back to the school. So with all this coming together now, there's an intense amount of interest in this era of history, and we're finding that people really are interested in knowing more and more about what happened at the Carlisle School and then all the other boarding schools that were modeled after Carlisle. So these newspapers are an amazing source of that information. If you've been over to the barracks, the Letort View Community Center, which when I was younger used to be called the Officers Club, that was the printing office. The printing office actually was in that space, and the printing office that you see here in this postcard has been completely remodeled, and now it's the Letort View Community Center. So that's where the man on the bandstand, who was the editor of the newspaper and who also was not a man, but was a woman named Mariana Burgess, who is right in the center of that photo with all the printer students around her. You see the woman right in the center with a very fair face? That's Mariana Burgess, MB, man on the bandstand. And she actually wrote a book called Stia, which was designed as a primer for Indian girls to take back to their home communities to remind them of all of the genteel, I should say, skills they learned in being a proper young lady at Carlisle. And it was written by Embe, E-M-B-E, the pen name for Mariana Burgess, the man on the bandstand. So, you know, if you're intrigued by that, there's some great writing that we have in our collections by Jacqueline Fear-Segal, who really lays out who that man on the bandstand is, or was, I should say. Whoops. All right, so now, moving along, we're going to go to the gym. The gym is still standing at the Indian School. It was built during the Indian School years. It was started around 1886 when Richard Henry Pratt petitioned the War Department or the Interior Department, I should say, for a gymnasium so that he could exercise the students. And of course, the United States said no, that was frivolous for a school to have a gym. So Pratt was able to get funding through his Quaker connections and from former students who were alumni by that time of the school. And they built the gym, which is still standing. In fact, the Army, I guess maybe 15 years ago, went in and remodeled the gym to replicate what it looked like during the Indian school years when it was first built. So that, like I said, that building was still standing. And by the way, that's the girls' dormitory attached to the gym. Scenes from the gym. The interior, you can see the runners walk inside. That is still there in that gym. And their students had gym privileges. The girls had gym privileges once a week, and the boys had privileges all other 4 days of the week. And they had basketball standards in there. When the Army remodeled the gym, like I said, about maybe 15 years ago, some of you might know better because I don't remember things anymore. But they found tumbling equipment up above the drop ceiling, and they found, you know, basketball standards were up there, and they kind of rediscovered some of the stuff from the Indian school years. But gym and sports are a really important part of the Carlisle story, as you all know. There's the most famous student, Jim Thorpe, who was the greatest athlete of the 20th century, who you see in that middle photo. He could do anything. He was an amazingly swift runner. He excelled in track. He was captain of the basketball team in 1910. And then there are the football stories. I don't know how many of you know the amazing football stories at the Carlisle School. But I mean, these football teams that were not made up of these huge strapping young men, but these were kind of small in some cases. Now, Jim Thorpe was a pretty big guy, but a lot of those football players were just very quick and very cunning. And they were doing these amazing things. They were beating Ivy League schools, which we'll talk about more when we get to Pop Warner's house. But Jim Thorpe, when, I don't know if you all were here for the 250th anniversary of the county, but they had a parade through Carlisle, and they invited Jack and Bill Thorpe, Jim Thorpe's two sons, to come and march in the parade. And those guys came over here, and I met them, and you know, we started talking about all the stories we knew about Jim Thorpe. And so I said, well, I'm going to tell you a story I heard. And that is that when the track team played against Lehigh University in Allentown, is that Lehigh? The coach from Lehigh met the coach from Carlisle at the train, and it was Pop Warner, the coach at the train. And the Lehigh coach said to Warner, "Where's your team?" And Warner said, "Oh, they'll be along any minute." And these two guys got off the train. Just two guys, Jim Thorpe and Louis Tawanama, the great Hopi runner. And these two guys won every single event at that track meet. And you know, I was feeling really good because I got to tell Jack this really great story about his dad, right? So he said, "Oh, I heard that story, but I heard it kind of different. The way I heard it was, Pop Warner got off the train and the Lehigh coach was there to meet him, and the Lehigh coach said, 'Where's your team?' And Pop Warner said, 'Oh, they'll be along any minute.' And pretty soon these two guys come running alongside the train. They had run all the way from Carlisle to Allentown, and they went along to win every event. So that's who Jim Thorpe was. He was bigger than life. He was legendary. All these stories about him are just, you know, legendary stories. And when I'm visiting with descendants from the Indian School and I'm talking about all these instances of loss of language and loss of culture and loss of tradition, and you know, it's so difficult, and you know, people are very quiet. But when you get to the part of the story about sports and what happened in this little community and these amazing, amazing athletes, it's a magical thing. It's a really magical thing that happened. And it's wonderful to be able to talk about that. Also in the gym, that was where the commencement exercises were held. So if you, now 10,700 kids, remember that number. Of that number, we know of 758 who actually graduated, got graduation certificates, attended commencement exercises, which were held in the gym, right in the assembly area of the gym. They also, if you've been over to the gym, the original structure looks very much like a barn. It's shaped like a barn, and the roof has that barn-like structure. And the front part of the gym was added on, and it has meeting rooms on several floors. And those meeting rooms are where the debating society met, and debating society, the YMCA met there too eventually, that hotbed of resistance. Because at the YMCA, after when Pop Warner was at the school, by 1912, the conditions at the school had started to deteriorate, and many of the football players were complaining about the conditions at the school, and they felt that Pop Warner was not a good role model for them because he swore and he smoked tobacco, which was, you know, the whole temperance movement was a big problem. And they started a petitioning campaign in the YMCA. It was begun by Gus Welch, who was the quarterback of the 1912 football team. And they carried petitions down to the Senate, the United States Senate, and there was an investigation at the Indian School. One of the things that they did was, of course, they followed the money, and they found some improprieties that were happening at the school. And so that really was the beginning of the end of the Carlisle Indian School. That happened in 1913. So, but now we're going to go to the administration building. Back on track here. Right next to the superintendent's quarters, on the opposite side of the campus, was the administration building that was built, again, with Indian labor. And it seems that almost every year there was a formation where the students were posed in front of the administration building for this annual photograph of the population of the school. But it's also where Pratt had his offices. It's where the banking was conducted. All the students had bank accounts that were housed in this building instead of in a bank downtown, go figure. And, one of the things the Senate investigation found was that the amounts in student bank books didn't really jive with the records that were kept in the administration building. So, that was problematic too. And then there's the model home. Now, if you're standing on the bandstand, you can't see the model home. And I don't have a picture of it, but there's this tiny little building that's located right behind the Corin Apartments. That was built as a domestic arts cottage for the girls. Kind of like a home ec building. I don't even know if they do home ec anymore, but when I was a kid, we took home economics. And we learned how to sew and how to cook and how to bake and how to set a proper table. That's what these girls learned in the domestic arts buildings. And they would have little parties and invite the boys sometimes to come to these parties. So that was, the place where these young Victorian garbed ladies learned how to be a proper housewife, become a proper housewife. And then there's the school building, which was built for the Carlisle Indian School and is no longer standing there. But it is located there's a road right now, and there's that dragoon circle with some buildings around it. That's where the school building stood during the Indian School years. And so that's where all the classrooms, academic classrooms, were located during the Indian School years. And here you see a small children's singing class. It looks almost like they might be learning the Itsy Bitsy Spider or, one of those finger songs. And then you see a much more sophisticated physics class. That would be a 10th grade class. So, you're looking at a real span of ages and grades at the Carlisle Indian School. And then in the middle of the building there was a chapel because they tore down the old chapel when they built the administration building, and an assembly and a library. So now we're going to visit the hospital, and there are two hospital buildings. The original hospital was built at the very northern top of the campus. It's now called Washington Hall and is a guest house. So they built that because with this huge population of kids coming from all these different communities, many of whom had not been exposed to diseases that others had been exposed to, these children were very vulnerable to disease. And so they had to have a hospital. This kind of gives you a view of the campus. So that's what the hospital looks like today, which it's called Washington Hall. And then there's the hospital after it was built with the assistant superintendent's quarters, disciplinarian quarters right next to it. And here's a view, an old postcard that shows the campus looking from the south to the north. And there's a flagpole right in front of the superintendent's quarters. So this kind of gives you an idea of the parade area with hospital at the very northern part of it. Then around the turn of the century, the Indian School built a new hospital. And there's a student at Dickinson College, actually he's already a graduate, a postgraduate student I guess you'd call him, who's working on this digitization project. He has been doing a lot of research into the medical side of these stories. And what he's discovering is that at the Carlisle Indian School, there was a lot of advanced technology in their hospital program. They actually had an X-ray machine in the new hospital that they built, which was used by the Carlisle community at times when they needed X-rays. So, this idea of this being a very backward sort of degraded place doesn't bear out when you start looking at the medical part of these stories. And Frank Vitale's work is is very kind of new and cutting edge, and it's going to be real interesting to see what he finds as he delves deeper into what was happening technologically at the Carlisle Indian School Hospital. They had an apothecary in the hospital. There was a nurses training program. So like when I go and give programs at Indian Health Service, a lot of times people will come up and tell me that their grandmas learned nursing at the Carlisle Indian School, and their moms were nurses and they're nurses, and you know, that kind of trickle down thing that happens. But one of the celebrity doctors at the Carlisle School was Carlos Montezuma, who you see in the middle of that picture. Carlos Montezuma was an Apache who grew up before the reservations were formed, and there was a massacre in a cave in which most of his relatives were killed by the United States cavalry. And he happened not to be with his relatives that day. He was off hunting or fishing with an uncle, and he was spared. And so he was captured by another group of natives, some Pima Indians, who sold him to an Italian itinerant photographer named Carlos Gentili, who was on his way out west to photograph the gold rush. So this kid, Carlos Montezuma, represented to Pratt the ultimate assimilated Indian, because he lived with the white people and he was raised by white people, and he ended up in Chicago and went to the Chicago Medical College and became a practicing physician. And this guy, Carlos Montezuma, became sort of the poster boy for Pratt whenever he would want to kind of exploit how this program was successful, you know, and if you take the Indian out of his environment and put him in a new environment, you know, that's Carlos Montezuma. So Carlos Montezuma was invited to the opening of the Brooklyn Bridge and invited to various events to talk about, you know, how successful he was. And his story is fascinating because he was completely disenfranchised from his people, and he was a very wounded person as a consequence of that, and ultimately reconnected, found some of his relatives who had survived, and went to live with his relatives, and he died in a teepee. He went what Pratt called back to the blanket, as a means to survive. And so his story is very unique. I mean, when you think about all those children, and that the idea was that after going through this process for 5 years or however long, that they would not go back to the reservation, but literally get swallowed up in the white world and make their way, that's not what happened. Almost all of these children went back to their home communities with these very conflicted identities. And so, you know, this particular experiment gets the blame for many of the ills among people on the reservations today. The problems of alcoholism, meth abuse, spousal abuse, drug abuse, you know, because they were taken from their families for a whole block of time during their nurturing years. And, you know, not only were they deprived of that nurturing of their family and extended family, but their families were deprived of, you know, having them. So it's a very complicated and interesting set of events and stories that are really being looked at now. There's a Native American boarding school healing project that is looking intensely at the records at Dickinson College and the materials that we have in our newspapers to try to address some of these issues that are happening out there. This is the new hospital, the state-of-the-art hospital. Carlos Montezuma was also a member of the Cumberland County Medical Society. In fact, he was president of the Medical Society for a few years. So he was a pretty well-known guy around here. Okay, so now we're going to go visit the industrial shops, which are no longer there. There were stables way up, you can see where the athletic field is, and behind where the boys' dormitory was. These stables were converted to shops, and that's where the boys had their industrial training. And this is a very busy collage, bless you, of the different trades that the boys learned at the Indian School. Blacksmithing, carpentry, tailor shop. Jim Thorpe did a good bit of time in the tailor shop. Carriage making. The wall that you can see over at the barracks was constructed by the masons at the Indian School. And then the girls had their industrial training in the dining hall. Again, this building is no longer standing. It was right at the corner of Pratt Avenue and I forget the name of this road that goes by the Letort View.
Lovell?
Lovell, okay. Lovett or Lovell?
Lovell.
Lovell, okay. But here you see the girls, well, these girls actually, this lithograph here shows them walking in the snow to the dining hall. Like I said, the campus was segregated, so the girls would walk in on one line and go in one door, and then the boys walked in another line, went in the other door. And there you can see what the building looked like during the school days. And also in the dining room was where the girls learned their industries. Their vocational training was learning how to sew, learning how to bake, learning child care. And they also had a literary society, the Susan Longstreth Literary Society, that was named after a Quaker benefactor who gave money toward the school. So, these girls who were on a graduation track could stand up and debate the important questions of the day. They could get up in front of an audience and give a talk, and they were very accomplished. So, I also included these outing images because the outing program at Carlisle was not what we consider outing today, but children were sent out into non-native families where they lived with those families over the summer. So if you were a kid at a boarding school or a parent of a boarding school child, you would expect to go home over the summer vacation or over the winter holidays, but these kids did not go home. They went out with a capital O into these families in Lancaster County, Bucks County, Berks County, Maryland, Hagerstown. I did a talk a couple weeks ago in Mechanicsburg and discovered there were 33 families in Mechanicsburg that had kids in their homes. So there were, in Adams County, there was a whole set of Orchard families that had Carlisle girls in their homes on outing who lived there. Sometimes they lived there year-round and went to public school with their non-native siblings. So, Pratt considered outing, he called it the ultimate immersion. Richard Henry Pratt, he gets associated with these very violent metaphors. You heard, kill the Indian, save the man. That was Pratt's philosophy. If you remove everything traditional from the identity of this person and pack it with European, American dominant culture, you will transform the identity of these children. That was his goal. He likened his philosophy to Christian baptism. When he gave a talk to a group of ministers, he said, we like to hold these children under until they're thoroughly soaked. And when they come out, they will be, quote, civilized. So, that very violent, the drowning metaphor is how he's perceived, even today. So, you'll often see that phrase, kill the Indian, save the man. speaking of whitewashing, now we're gonna go to the laundry. The laundry building is still standing. It's right at the intersection of Lovell and Pratt Avenue. And here you can see a scene inside the laundry. Here are girls working in the laundry. There were boys that worked in the laundry too, but I don't know that I've seen co-ed pictures of them at the same time. But you kind of get a sense of how the school was basically self-sufficient. They did their own laundry, they made their own clothing in the sewing and tailor shops. They had a garden, they had a farm. You know, they tried to keep it as self-sufficient as possible during the, especially during the later years. And there's the Loop Indian Art Studio. That building is still standing, and it is was built as a studio for Angel Decorah, who is the woman on the left. She's Ho-Chunk, or she would have been known as Winnebago at the Indian School. She was a very accomplished artist who was hired after Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, and he appointed a new commissioner of Indian Affairs who did not subscribe to this transformation philosophy, but felt that it would be more practical to gently influence these children into, quote, civilization. And that's because by that time, this was like 1905, I guess Roosevelt was elected in 1904. By that time, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. People were traveling out west and collecting Navajo rugs and Pueblo pottery and Chitimacha baskets, and to remove everything traditional from these children would be to deprive them of some very real economic opportunities through the arts. And so Angel was hired to be the art instructor at the Carlisle Indian School, and she founded the Native Arts and Crafts program. And then Pratt was gone by that time, so you know there was a kind of a change in how things were structured at the Carlisle School, and the art department began to create the kinds of pieces that people bring us that they find in their attics as souvenirs, you know, beaded necklaces and baskets and stuff that was actually made at the Indian School and sold there. So Angel became the art instructor, and she hired this guy, Lone Star Dietz, William Lone Star Dietz, who passed himself off as Oglala Sioux, but was really not Native at all. He was a white guy who pretended to be Indian to get into the Carlisle School. And she hired him as her assistant because he was a great artist. And then she married him because he was pretty good looking. And the two of them ran this art department. And then there was this relationship between art and sport at Carlisle, because Lone Star Dietz was also a great football player who became a very well-known football coach, coached for University of Washington, I believe it was. And one of our staff just recently has uncovered some documentation of Lone Star's fakery, because he was arrested for draft evasion because he claimed that he was Indian and was not a citizen, and it was proved that he certainly was a citizen and not Indian at all.
Ma'am?
Yeah.
You said that building is still there.
Yes.
I'm having trouble placing.
Okay, it's the communications building here. It's located right by the new entrance that's not an entrance anymore, right across the street from Pop Warner's house.
Okay, thank you.
And it's that, it looks like that stone at the Cumberland County Prison. It looks like maybe the same architect, because it has these like turrets.
I wondered about that one.
Well, it doesn't still have the turrets. It's just a square building. And I think it's a communications or a signal building now. So, moving right along, we're going to go to Pop Warner's house and talk about sports again, because this house that stands at the very bottom, far western part of the base, over by where the new improved entrance was, the trolley actually came up that road that connects Route 11 to Garrison, or to Pratt Avenue. It came right across the creek. There was a big bridge there, and you can still see the footings for the width of the bridge. And Pop Warner's house would be the first house on the right as you came in. Now, Pop Warner was not a member of Indian Service, and he was not a military guy, but it was Pratt who actually hired him to come to Carlisle and to develop the football teams, because there was just clearly a lot of talent, athletic talent, in these 1890 teams. And Pop Warner and Louis Tawanama and Jim Thorpe, these two students, Tawanama and Thorpe, were Olympians who went to the, Thorpe went to the 1912 Olympics and won gold medal in the decathlon and pentathlon. And Louis Tawanama went to the 1908 and 1912 Olympics. He was an amazing Hopi runner. They still have a run on Second Mesa in honor of Tawanama every year. And, but these football teams, I mean, I don't know if any of you have read Sally Jenkins' book, The Real All-Americans, or know about, I mean, these football players were kind of like the Harlem Globetrotters of football. I mean, they did these amazing stunts. And, you know, we're talking about an era in football when football was just sort of this mass of testosterone that moved up and down a muddy field without protective gear and without sophisticated plays. I mean, people died. Men died playing football. It was dangerous. And one of the Carlisle football players broke his leg. Stacy Matlock, who was became a Pawnee council chair. He broke his leg, and when that happened, Pratt said, "That's it. You know, I'm trying to teach you to be gentlemen, and you're out there, you know, doing this very uncivilized activity called football." And so Pop Warner was starting to become well known, and Pratt, the football boys petitioned Pratt, promising that they would never slug and they would play in a gentlemanly way. And so Pratt hired Pop Warner to come to Carlisle, and they devised these plays that were a little unorthodox, to say the least. The tailor shop sewed a pouch in the back of the receiver's jersey, and when the quarterback threw the ball and the receiver got it, he hid the ball under his jersey and ran down the field, touchdown. And, you know, I mean, they sewed these leather football patches to the front of their jerseys. They all had these, and they all ran down the field like this, and nobody knew who had the ball. Touchdown. So, you know, they became very well known, and they were just amazingly talented, and were beating Ivy League teams like Princeton and Harvard and Yale and Penn. They played the first game under electric lights in Chicago when they played against the University of Illinois. So, I mean, this was a big deal. And, you know, it also meant a lot of gate receipts. Money was coming into this little community. And, you know, that was another piece of the whole scandal problem. But, you know, like I said, there was this very magic stuff that happened. And if you all listen to National Public Radio, if you ever listen to Radio Lab that's on Saturday afternoon, Radio Lab did a football show. And what they discovered was that football, as we know it today, was developed at the Carlisle Indian School. So you go to radiolab.org and click on football, and you'll hear that story about how that happened. Also, on our tour, and probably the last stop is the farmhouse, which is, the farmhouse was slated to be demolished a few years ago, and this is what it looked like during the Indian School years. It's where they trained the boys for outing in farming techniques. And, it was a critical piece of the history of the school when all those other buildings that we visited were put on the National Register. The farmhouse was somehow left off. I don't know if they just didn't research it or, they felt it wasn't relevant, but it was left off. And so the Carlisle Barracks was going to tear this down and put up one of those RCI, one of those plastic houses that you see over there, duplex things. And this Mohawk woman, Dr. Llewellyn White, who teaches Native Studies in Montreal, got wind of it, and her grandpa, Philip White, had actually slept in that farmhouse, and she'd heard stories about this, and she said, well, that can't be right. And she started a petitioning campaign online and stopped the demolition of the farmhouse. And now the Army Corps of Engineers has, they've put the house on the National Register. I believe it's there now. And now, they have to figure out what to do with it. Lou White would love to make this farmhouse an interpretive center where people, especially descendants, could go and have what she would consider a safe place to kind of process everything that they're experiencing in that landscape. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen there. But Richard Davis and Nanny Davis, two Cheyenne, well, Richard was Cheyenne, his wife Nanny was Pawnee. Richard was the overseer of the farmhouse during the Indian School years. He married Nanny, and they had these two little girls, and one of them, Richenda Davis. Now, that name, Richenda, is not very common, but you do find it among some of the Cheyenne people, and that's named after Richard. So Richard Davis was very likely named after Richard Pratt, and Richenda would have been named after them. And her, Richenda's granddaughter, Grace Slaughter, visited the farmhouse, was one of the people actively involved in the petitioning. And so, we have pictures of her with her relatives. Here you can see the interior of the farmhouse. Lou White will be here in June, and I think she'll probably do a program about the farmhouse. And then there's the guardhouse, which you all know, the old Hessian powder magazine that's still standing there. That was actually built as a powder magazine, converted to a guardhouse during the Civil War era, and then during the Indian School years, it's where they trained the guards. It was not typically where people were punished. There was a block guardhouse attached to the boys' dormitory. So when you see references to kids being locked in the guardhouse, that would have been not this guardhouse, but the place attached to the dorm, boys' dorm. And last, the cemetery. Have any of you been over to the Indian School Cemetery? I'm sure you've driven past it. That cemetery was originally located behind where the grandstand is now, and it was moved in the early 1930s to this tiny footprint at what was the back gate of the barracks. The United States literally tried to erase it off the map and put it in this little back space, and it's very ironic because now if you go over to the barracks, you have to enter at that gate, so the first thing you see is this cemetery. We know of 192 children who were buried at the Indian School Cemetery. There are 14 unknown stones in that cemetery, and we have uncovered the names of all but two through the research using the newspapers and burial records and Dickinson's project. So, you know, and there are 3 graves that are scheduled to be disinterred this summer of Northern Cheyenne woman who her relatives are buried in that cemetery. So things are changing in there. But the picture on the upper right is Thomas Marshall, who was Yankton Sioux, and his grave is the large stone right in the center of the cemetery under the weeping cherry tree. He was not really a student at the Carlisle Indian School, but he was kind of the RA of the small boys dormitory, and he was a student at Dickinson College. So Dickinson erected this, their YMCA erected this large stone in tribute of him. And then I'm showing the picture of Eunice Suisun. Eunice was one of the Chiricahua Apache who were prisoners of war at Carlisle. When Geronimo was finally brought in 1886 or 87, his band, his people, were sent to St. Augustine to the same fort, the Fort Marion, where those Kiowa Comanche prisoners of war were. And Pratt went to the fort and literally took children from their mother's arms. I mean, when people ask what were the circumstances surrounding children being sent to Carlisle, those children had no choice. They were prisoners of war, and they were extremely vulnerable to disease when they came to Carlisle. So in this cemetery, there are it represents about, I think, 33 different nations, and of them, 50 are these Chiricahua Apaches, and 2 of them under the unknown stones are babies that were born to women who were pregnant when they were brought to Carlisle. And Eunice Suisun, both her husband, Neil, and her baby are buried in that cemetery. There's no stone for her baby, so we know that's one of the unknown stones. There is a stone for her husband. But I mean, that is one of the more tragic stories that come out of this episode of these, especially the Chiricahua Apaches. So many of them perished when they came to the school. So. But this cemetery is visited often, and you know, if you drive past, or if you come on Memorial Day weekend, there's a group of people from the general Washington, D.C. area. They come up every Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, and they check on the cemetery, and they replace the silk flowers that, you know, that are starting to get funky looking, and they do ceremonies in the cemetery, and they sing songs, and they're very welcoming if anybody were to show up, you know, if you wanted to go there and participate, they will welcome you. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah?
Can you edify us regarding the rumor that some of the remains were not actually moved from the original site to this site?
I can tell you that there is a newspaper article that was published in the Sentinel that described the moving of the original cemetery. And it's very graphic and gruesome. And it's very clear that the remains were moved. I'm told, I mean, I'm not really in touch with the Army Corps of Engineers. I'm not their favorite person, apparently. But I have heard that they did do ground penetrating radar not long ago there, in the last few months, because at this cemetery. And the report I heard anecdotally is that they did not find anything outside the, you know, the borders of the stones. Now, I don't know if they took that ground penetrating radar to the old cemetery site. You know, that would be something maybe one of you could find out more easily than I. But That I know from that article, and there are copies of that article floating around if you ever wanted to see it. I have a copy of it.
And that's from what?
It's in the Sentinel from 1929 or 1930. It was one of those CCC projects. You know, it was local fellows from our community that were hired to actually exhume the bodies, the remains. And there are descriptions of what they found, so.
So they moved it because they wanted to put another building there?
They wanted to, yeah, they had to build a road.
Collins?
Yeah. Yeah, the original footprint of the cemetery, you can see it in some of these, well, there, you can see it there. Look at the Indian field and the lines of that, what would you call that shape? A hexagon? Trapezoid, thank you. Yeah, and it would, I mean, a research partner and I stepped it out one day. We had a bunch of maps that we got at MHI, and we stepped it out from 2 different points and ended up in the same place, and we ended up right in front of maybe several hundred yards in front of that one-way sign that goes, what's that road? Forbes, yes. So it would have been, like it would have come all the way up to the front of Root Hall and probably taken up part of the new athletic gym there, you know, and went behind the grandstand. Yeah. So now we're going to leave the barracks and we're just going to come downtown for a second on our way home, on our way out, because we're standing in front of, at the square, I don't know if you all know that, there is a plaque that commemorates Jim Thorpe. And it was put up at the square in 1951 at the premiere of that movie, Jim Thorpe All-American. If any of you ever stay up late at night and watch the History Channel, you'll see it, you know, yeah. So, and that's Carl Thorpe, Jim Thorpe's son, who was in the service at the time, and Jim Thorpe, Phyllis Thaxter, the actress who played his wife in that movie, Governor Fine, the governor of Pennsylvania in 1951, and then the commandant of the War College, whose name I don't know. And then this picture is of Geronimo in 1905, marching down High Street, right in front of, I guess, what would be M&T Bank. When Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, Geronimo and 4 other tribal headmen, Quanah Parker, the Comanche and American horse, who was Sioux, and Buckskin Charlie, who's Ute, and another one, marched right down Main Street in this parade, and then they went to Washington, D.C. and marched in Teddy Roosevelt's parade. It happened right here, right down that street. And I can't, oh, these are all the chiefs that I was just mentioning. Yeah. Quanah Parker, Geronimo, Buckskin Charlie, American horse. I can't remember the other one. But I do want to mention that we have a conference here every other year, biennial conference called Carlisle Journeys, and this coming conference in 2018, October 2018, will mark the centennial of the closing of the Indian School. So we're going to be doing our conference in conjunction with Dickinson College. They have an amazing art exhibit set up, and they're doing a lot of programming for the Carlisle Indian School. In fact, Dickinson has just hired a professor to start a Native American Studies program over at the college. She's going to be teaching Native American Studies, and she's also going to be teaching Native American literature. So, like I said, this is not going to disappear. It's very much a part of the conversation today. So thank you for your attention. see if I can figure out how to turn this off. We do sell these maps over in our shop in History on High, if you know where that is. Yeah, question?
I'm very simplistic question.
Yeah.
How did they convince these people to give up the children for the first eight batch?
Yeah.
How did they?
That Pratt was very convincing, and when he got this idea for the Indian school, the United States War Department, who he was working with, insisted that he first go to those tribal headmen with whom they were having the most difficulty treating. So he had to go to Spotted Tail and Red Cloud at the Rosebud Sioux Agency and Pine Ridge Sioux in South Dakota, and Pratt went there and he had a conversation with Spotted Tail, and he said, you know, no matter what happens, the white man is going to keep coming and coming. This is in the summer of 1879. And if your children knew how to read and write English, they would not sign the treaties to give up the Black Hills. And owing to the fact that you and I have to speak with an interpreter, you can't really be sure of the meaning of my words. You know, you can't really trust me. But if you knew how to speak English, it would be different. Of course, it didn't occur to him if he could speak Lakota, perhaps they could. But still, but it was convincing, and Spotted Tail agreed to send his children, and then Pratt went west to Pine Ridge, and he said to Red Cloud, Spotted Tail is sending his children. Don't you want your children to have the same opportunity? And then his prisoners who had been converted to Christianity and bought into this, because they saw the futility of living on the reservation, they did the same thing. They went to their headmen and said, Spotted Tail, Red Cloud are sending theirs. The Cheyenne, people sent their kids, and the Kiowa did too. So you have these pockets of Sioux kids and Kiowa and Comanche and Cheyenne and Arapaho in the first groups of kids to come. And, and that started to kind of build up in the West. And then in the Pueblos, there were two white men from Ohio, the Marmon brothers, who married into the Laguna Pueblo. And, they were starting this assimilation process among the Pueblos. And, so then you start to have Pueblo kids fairly early on, and then, they just kind of catapulted. But then when Spotted Tail came to visit his children on his way to see the president, because, whenever those tribal headmen had business in Washington, they'd come through Carlisle. And he saw his children in uniform, in the same looking uniforms as those cavalry officers who he had fought against at the Battle of the Greasy Grass. He was outraged, and he ordered all his children be sent back to South Dakota. And Pratt trotted up there again and, convinced him that it'd be best if those children were here, and so they came back. So there was a lot of that kind of give and take stuff. Yeah. Yeah, you.
You said the graduation rate was so low,
Yeah.
less than 10%. Why?
Well, I'm not sure what the graduation rate was in the general population either.
That's true.
So, in between 1879 and 1918, or certainly between 1879 and 1900, I know my husband's father didn't graduate from high school. How many of our grandpas and great-grandpas graduated from high school? So, that's not a shocking rate. But I think it's an important statistic because most kids did come through this program with some kind of a certificate in an industry. If it were a girl, it'd be sewing and laundry or housekeeping, or maybe nursing. Yeah.
Along that same line, the ones that didn't graduate, did they go back to the reservation for the most part? were they, or were they assimilated in society? What
Almost-
happened to the non-graduates?
Almost all these children went back to the agencies. The exceptions were those who went into Indian service. So those nurses in the nurses training program got jobs in Indian Health Service. Teachers worked in other Indian schools. There were a whole bunch of girls who graduated and went to Westchester Normal, Shippensburg Normal, Bloomsburg State, and got teaching certificates, and then worked in other Indian schools. So that was kind of a typical thing, which Pratt did not approve of. He was always at odds with the Indian Bureau. But most of them went back to their home communities, and the exception were those football players, the athletes. It's real interesting. And you know, we're gonna know a lot more as this Dickinson project, here, I lost my slip here. If anybody is interested, if you go to www.carlisleiindian.dickinson.edu or pick up one of these flyers in the back, you can actually look at student records and see, I mean, and so because of that, we are going to have all kinds of great statistical information about what really happened to these kids, especially during the Friedman administration. After Pratt left, he did a survey and he tried to contact former students and find out where they were, if they owned property, if they were married, if they worked for the Indian service. You know, there's this kind of standard form that you can look at to see what happened to them. Yeah.
We lived in quarters on Garrison Lane for 5 years, and one Saturday morning, we woke up to a sound of drums, and it was full of teepees on the ceremony grounds, and they said they were having what's called a powwow.
Yeah.
And I was told by some of the guys there, they looked upon this place as like the Jewish people look upon Auschwitz.
Yeah.
Have you had feedback like that?
Yeah, yeah. I would say that in general, among descendants, that is the perception. And that was Powwow 2000, and this map was created for that event. And yeah, it's so complicated, but I mean, it's just a very complicated response that you get from descendants, because, you know, I've had people say, I have a degree, my parents have advanced degrees, my dad has a PhD, and you know, all that was learned. Those are values that were passed down because of what happened at Carlisle. But we can't speak our language, and my auntie is buried in the cemetery. I mean, that's the story of Michael Trujillo, the former Surgeon General, head of Indian Health Service. His auntie is buried in the second row of that first section of the cemetery, and you know, it is heartbreaking that that family lost a relative and cannot speak their language. You know, there's a lot of effort to reclaim language now, but that's what I hear from people. Did you have a question?
How did they pick the kids from when they went, you know, from the Indians? How did they pick who?
They, the very first kids to come were, you know, sent by those tribal headmen and those former prisoners. So they were relatives of the former prisoners. A lot of them were. But then they started feeding kids from mission schools. Like the Jesuits were very active in missioning to the various, especially the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa tribes, or the Stockbridge. If you look at that first picture of graduating kids, they're all Chippewa, Stockbridge, because they already knew English and they had already been exposed to, you know, the so-called civilizing way. And then there were the prisoners of war who had no say. And then there was this little tiny group of Chitimacha people from Charenton, Louisiana, who sent their children to Carlisle to protect them from the drive-by shootings on the reservation. If you go down to Charenton, Louisiana and look at this agency where they lived, They have these wooden houses with these heavy porches, heavy shutters on the porches that they built to protect themselves from outsiders coming through and just picking them off the porches. So, I mean, there's such a variety of experience and history among these various nations that, you know, one thing we do see on those applications, I think the applications for enrollment after 1900 have a clause that says, no one has forced me to sign this paper. No one has withheld rations from me. So that's kind of a clue about what could have been happening before that. Yeah.
Did you find that Richard Pratt had any redeeming perspectives about the Indians to balance the kill the Indian, save the man? I mean, did he have?
Yeah, that's a question that I will never answer. I mean, because I just don't see how there can be balance in that kind of racism. It's really hard evaluating Pratt. Yeah, I know.
Balance, I'm saying, was
His
there
int-
anything on the other side of the scale that you
Yeah.
read that he said that he cared about these guys? I mean, he's the one that took them out of the chains.
Well, if you look at the letters back to the school, in this project, you'll see the phrase, "Dear old Carlisle," over and over again. The students writing back using that phrase. And how is dear old Carlisle? And, you know, how are my friends at Carlisle? And they will say, "My dear school father." That will be the, what is that called? The salutation on the letters. "To my dear school father." So it's just so complicated, I think. And, you know, it's all the intentions. It's all about those good intentions. I mean, I just saw, somebody sent me a video of a school called CIIS, Kiss. Have any of you heard of this? There are these schools, there are like 5 or 6 of them in India and in Malaysia, where they take kids from their tribal communities and they put them in uniforms and they show all this propaganda video of how they're succeeding, you know, and it's all, there. You know, I look at that and somebody's gonna look at that and say, wow. In fact, the comments on the YouTube video are all, "This is amazing what they're doing." And I look at that and I just get sick to my stomach because, you know, just because of what I know. So it's real hard for me to be objective. I will say that the Pratt family had a reunion here maybe 20 years ago. You know, his great-grandson, who looks just like him, and, you know, nieces and nephews. And, you know, I mean, it was really fun. And I did this whole program kind of thing, and, you know, we had a great time together. We went over to the Military History Institute, and I still email with them. And, you know, I have arguments with them, but they're very open-minded about, you know, the legacy, the whole legacy of what their dad is. So, yeah.
The movie that was being made about this, do
Yeah.
you know anything about
Which?
what stage? Well, there was a new one.
Oh yeah, John Sayles is working on a movie.
It's still in process.
It's all about finding money.
And did both, or the other bridges, did a movie come out that we can find anywhere?
No.
Or have a picture?
No, nothing ever came of that.
Jeff Bridges.
Jeff and Bo Bridges were working on that project, and
There was a movie on the History Channel.
Yeah, there-
About Pratt, and
Yeah.
went through the whole thing, and it was really good, but I don't know the name of it.
yeah, I think it was called Into the West, maybe. There was one on TNT. There was one on TNT after that I think used a lot of the same sort of script ideas that he had. So I don't, you know, it's all luck. It's all about luck. There are probably 6 or 8 movies that have been in the wind about this. So, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.